As a reporter, I've traveled the Middle East for many years. It's an area that has always fascinated me, but in my work, I've mainly covered its war zones, its crises, and its tragedies. This journey, which takes me down the Silk Road in the footsteps of Marco Polo, gives me the opportunity of exploring the great historical and cultural significance of this part of the world, its ancient melting pot of peoples and civilizations that have contributed so much to our own. The second leg of my trip through Uzbekistan takes me from Bukhara to Samarkand. The old caravan trail still follows the same route as it did thousands of years ago, except that today, the trail has become a highway and the Bactrian camels have been replaced by trucks. We're on the royal route, what was formerly the middle section of the Silk Road that connected Bukhara to Samarkand. Every 40 kilometers, there was a fortified caravanserai called a rabat. This is Rabat-i-Malik, the King's Rabat, with its monumental gate, 12 meters high, that opens onto, well, not much at all. Built in the 11th century by the Sultan Shams al-Mulk, this is one of the largest and oldest caravanserais in Central Asia. On the routes, caravanserais were placed approximately 40 kilometers apart at the most, since this was the distance a caravan of camels could walk in a day. The royal route, also known as the Golden Road, due to the prosperity and significance of this area, thus had 5 main rabats on the way from Bukhara to Samarkand. These rabats were just as important as gas stations, but the truckers today don't even glance at them as they go by. The Golden Road has been a vital part of the Silk Road ever since the first caravans were reported to have travelled it nearly 3,000 years ago. And in the 4th century, this was the road that the Chinese monk Faxian took when he set off in search of the sacred Buddhist texts in India and Afghanistan. Later on, it was also via this road that Manichaeism, the religion of good and evil, would spread from Iran, and Islam from Saudi Arabia. A little to the north of the road lies the ancient city of Nurata. It would become one of Alexander the Great's most distant conquests. If Alexander stationed his army here, it was because of the pure freshwater spring which gushes forth in the middle of this desert. Fishing is not allowed here. Drinking the water, however, will ensure you, the pilgrims say, a long and prosperous life. This is the sacred water from the spring. This fortress in adobe was built by Alexander the Great in 300 BC using the same technique that is still used today. Although worn down by centuries and centuries of erosion, Alexander's fortress is still standing in spite of everything, like a witness, a sentinel keeping a lookout on the steppes of the ancient world as it was known to Europe until Marco Polo. It's seen all the great conquerors of Asia come by, from Genghis Khan to Stalin. As we continue our way down the Golden Road, we come to the crown jewel of the Silk Road. The Timurid emperors set out to make it one of the most beautiful cities in the world in the 14th century. A city that sounds like a promise, Samarkand. Even though Afghanistan is located just to the south, it's the Russian influence that at first seems to prevail here, especially in terms of its more joyful aspects. Rococo buildings in stucco with pastel colors, women in bright outfits. After the starkness of the desert, it's a delightful surprise to discover how pleasant life can be in this lush green city, where even the doves are tinted green, the color of hope. Samarkand indeed owes its fortune to the mildness of its climate, or more precisely, to the man who thus decided to make it his capital, a capital unsurpassed by any other, Tamerlan, or Timur the Lame, the Turco-Mongol clan leader who became a world conqueror. Tamerlan is the heart and soul of Samarkand. He considered himself a descendant of Genghis Khan and established the largest land empire in history. He razed and slaughtered his way across Asia, plundering and destroying ancient cities in his wake, but Tamerlan was also a great builder. He made Samarkand his capital and his mausoleum an architectural masterpiece to serve as his testament. This is Tamerlan, the terrible cenotaph. It's a cenotaph because the tomb is empty. His body is in the crypt below. Legend tells us that the following words were inscribed on his tomb. "Whosoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than myself." It was a warning that meant, do not open my grave, or you will let loose the spirit of war. Everyone heeded this warning for centuries until the Soviets, who were neither religious nor superstitious, decided they wanted to open the tomb in order to study his remains. It was the anthropologist Gerasimov who opened it on the night of the 21st of the 22nd of June, 1941. And that same night, Hitler launched the Nazi Operation Barbarossa and invaded the USSR. That didn't stop the Soviets from pursuing their examination of the skeleton. One of the things they discovered was that the hair that was still on Tamerlan's head was red. Again, according to the legend, which the Uzbeks firmly believe in, Stalin started having nightmares, seeing Tamerlan in his dreams. So he said to his henchmen, "Listen, we have to get rid of that corpse." It was taken out of the Kremlin's basement, put in a plane that circled over Moscow 3 times, before bringing the body back here to Uzbekistan. Tamerlan's remains were buried with full Islamic rituals, and a few weeks later, the Soviets won the Battle of Stalingrad. The Registan in Samarkand is regarded as one of the finest examples of Persian architecture. Although construction began under Tamerlan, the mosques and gigantic madrasas around the square are mainly the work of his grandson, the Timurid Sultan, Ulugh Beg. Completed in 1420, the Madrasa Ulugh Beg was the largest university in Central Asia. Many subjects were studied here, the Quran of course, as well as astronomy, mathematics, philosophy and literature. The Sultan himself would come to talk or even study with the students. Ulugh Beg was a poet, mathematician and astronomer who made Samarkand the empire's brilliant intellectual center. Professor Murudkhan Egashev is very passionate about the history of his city.
Before all this architecture was here, this was a huge marketplace back in the time of Amir Timur.
The Registan.
The sandy place. And all 6 avenues in the city of Samarkand came through here. This was the terminus for the caravans.
Of course, everything here is spectacular, is extraordinary. But there's one thing in particular that I find really interesting, and that's the mosaics, especially on this madrasa. They're very original. I've never seen anything like those tigers and gazelles before in Islamic decoration. What's it about?
Listen, in my opinion, they have to do with the signs of the zodiac. You see, I think they began, or perhaps finished, building here when the sun had entered the sign of the lion. There are also other theories that say that the lion represents the students or it represents power. And in fact, on Ulugh Beg's standard and on the money of the time, we find this tiger.
Okay, so it's not really a tiger, it's a lion.
We usually call it a lion.
Okay, and the figure being carried is thus the sun?
Ah, yes, the sun with a human face represents the enlightened mind. You see, the light.
By bringing craftsmen from all over his empire to come and work here, Tamerlan, or Amir Timur if you prefer, encouraged a syncretic style of art called Timurid art. One of its trademarks is the glazed tiling made of terracotta covered with a thin layer of glass that gets its bluish hue from the copper dyes. Wow, it's stunning. The Timurid style is also known for its trompe-l'œil designs. For example, on this dome in the Tilakari Mosque, which is covered with gold. What's interesting is that you speak of Tamerlane as a builder of empires, whereas in France we see him as a conqueror or someone who was destructive, who killed tens of thousands of people, like Attila or Genghis Khan. But you see him, on the contrary, as a great king. Besides, you don't see Tamerlane, that is, Timur the Lame, but Amir Timur.
Tamerlane is somewhat pejorative.
Tamerlane is pejorative?
Yes, it means, like you said, Timur the Lame.
But wasn't he lame?
Yes, he was lame. But that doesn't mean we should call him lame. You know, it's not polite.
I see. So what do you call him?
Simply Amir Timur.
Amir Timur. Prince Timur, right?
Yeah.
So was Amir Timur's empire a real empire, a centralized state, or was it mainly just a lot of conquered territories?
It was a real empire, a truly centralized state. For us, and for me personally, comparing Amir Timur to Attila or to Genghis Khan is, well, a little insulting. Look, the Mongols were here in our lands for almost 150 years, and they never built anything. While Amir Timur, even in the countries he invaded, set about building a lot of things. He built madrasas, caravanserais, bridges, etc. He spent most of his time on horseback, going out to conquer countries. But after each expedition, he would come back to Samarkand.
And he was always thinking of his capital here in Samarkand, since he did something that was rather peculiar, quite astonishing for a conqueror, really, which was to capture, to kidnap or imprison all of the highly skilled craftsmen in the cities that he took, and then bring them back here. And so how many craftsmen, how many artists were there here in the end?
Well, I can't tell you how many artists there were.
Dozens? Hundreds?
Maybe. There were at least 12 to 15 architecture schools here at the same time in the city of Samarkand. The ribbed domes, the torsades, everything was invented in Samarkand.
The ribbed dome was really invented in Samarkand?
Yes.
Because later on we find them in Delhi and in many different places.
But they're more recent.
So they were inspired by Samarkand. The city was already legendary back then.
Yes, it's often said that Alexander exclaimed when he saw Samarkand that everything he'd heard about it was true, except that it was even more beautiful than he'd imagined. So if he said that, he must have been right.
Samarkand is thus so beautiful that it makes Professor Ergashev get all mixed up in his chronology, since the city was built more than 1,000 years after Alexander came through here. But after all, there are all kinds of legends about the Greek conqueror on the Silk Road. Thank you. In Samarkand, the Grand Bazaar is still here to remind us of the golden age of the Silk Road. Dried fruits and nuts are a custom left over from those days. Light and long-lasting, they were a favorite food among caravaneers.
Assalamu alaikum.
Can I taste them?
Are you French?
Franza.
Zizou.
Zizou, yes.
Thierry Henry.
Thank you.
Grisman. Les fameux fruits secs.
The fabled dried fruit and nuts of the Silk Road. They could be carried in caravans, and they were one of Samarkand's big attractions. The city lured people by selling these delicious fruits and nuts. And it's true that the raisins here are incredible. Wow, honey crystals. Can I taste? The diversity of the faces is amazing. I can't get over it. Transoxiana lies at the crossroads between several worlds, and the result is a mosaic of the many peoples who have crisscrossed Asia throughout history. Today, some Uzbeks look like Turks, others like Iranians, while some look Chinese, Mongol, or almost Russian. It was said that the bread in Samarkand was so good that on his forays into faraway lands, Tamerlane would requisition bakers, flour, and all of the ingredients because he wanted to eat the same bread, and each time he'd be disappointed, the bread wouldn't be right. And it was said that a lot of bakers were executed to punish them for the bad bread they'd made. And in the end, he decided he would never travel without his own stock of bread. And so every day, while he was out on his conquests in India or Russia, there would be people going back and forth on horseback to bring him bread, freshly baked. If we go outside of the city centre to Afrasiab Hill, we come upon the remains of Samarkand, as the city was called at the time of Alexander the Great. We can see the ruins of a palace which belonged to the king of the Sogdian people. This palace also served as an enormous caravanserai. The king of Sogdiana thus acted at the same time as the head of the Merchants' Guild, which is to be expected since he was the ruler of one of the greatest trading cultures in history. Samarkand was founded in the 6th century BC by the Sogdians, and the Silk Road exists precisely because of the Sogdian people. They came from the Scythians, the nomads who dominated Eurasia for thousands of years. They were brilliant traders, as well as very educated and refined. One of the most famous Sogdians was the woman whom Alexander the Great fell in love with, Roxanne. For a long time, historians didn't know much about the Sogdians, except that their merchant kingdom controlled all of the caravans and trading posts from Persia to China. As the capital of Sogdiana, Samarkand was strategically located at the crossroads of all the major trade routes, and the Sogdians, who were basically a peaceful people, managed to turn their city into the main economic and cultural center of the entire region. Under the Soviet regime, archaeological excavation brought to light more information about the Sogdians, in particular due to the discovery of the ambassador's painting dating from the middle of the 7th century. This extraordinary mural shows the diplomatic activity of the Chinese, who are depicted here on a ceremonial visit to the king of Sogdiana. The Russian restorer, Marina Roitova, has devoted her life to trying to unravel its mysteries. The Sogdians are considered to be the true founders of the Silk Road. Can you tell us how far away their trading posts were, geographically speaking?
The people who lived here were very enterprising. And in Sogdiana, of course, there were a lot of goods that were valued in other countries. Sogdian merchants went to China, where they had their trading posts. When I visited China, I saw many pictures of Sogdians in the museum. And so they also went as far as the Altai, and thus all along the Silk Road. They were a very educated people and very enterprising in business. Even though the journeys were long, some took years, they traveled up and down the Silk Road on foot, were able to deal with all of the difficulties along the way, discover new territories, and conquer new markets. And so they not only forged strong commercial ties, but political ties as well. When a new baby was born, the family would smear its mouth and hand with honey so that later it would grow up to talk sweetly and money would stick to its hands. In other words, they prepared their children to go into commerce from a very early age.
Marina, you're a chemist. In the techniques used to create this mural, do you see the historical influences as coming more from the Middle East or more from methods from Asia?
The wall was prepared using a plaster made of clay, and then another kind of plaster called ganch was applied. Once the ganch was dry, they painted on top of it. This is a technique that is only used in Central Asia. As for the colors, various pigments were used. Ochre, charcoal, and gypsum were local pigments. But lazurite, which provided the color blue, was imported from Badakhshan. And studies have shown that the cinnabar, used for the red paint, and the ceruse, or white lead, were probably imported from China.
Marina, you've been restoring this mural for almost 4 decades now. You've dedicated your life to it. What do you think about when you're working on it? What is it that moves you in this work of art?
When you're working, especially out on the excavation site with the archaeologists, you feel like you're traveling back in time. You've left the 21st century and gone back to the 8th or the 7th century. Or even earlier, depending on the period in which the painting was created. It really is extraordinary. Your heart starts to beat as you uncover the painting very delicately, centimeter by centimeter. You can't wait to see what comes next. What else will you find? It's a very fascinating process, revealing the painting and seeing what was painted thousands of years ago.
It can now be seen in the mural that Marina is restoring. What makes Samarkand the epicenter of the Silk Road is the very visible influence of China. Silk, paper, printing, porcelain, gunpowder. The Chinese discovered all of these things centuries before Europe did. And these technical advances then passed through the hands of the Sogdians of Samarkand. A small paper mill continues to thrive on the outskirts of the city as a testimonial to this historical role. In the year 751, an Arab army defeated the army sent by the Emperor of China to conquer Central Asia. The Chinese prisoners of war were sent to Samarkand as slaves, where they would reveal the secret of making paper from the bark of the mulberry tree. Samarkand would become the main supplier of paper to the Arab world and then to all of Europe until the end of the Middle Ages. This fibre is incredibly resistant. I can't even... Can I try? So I'm taking it, I put it here, and then I pull. Was that right? To make paper, you need a lot of bark and even more water. The technique is relatively simple. First, the mulberry bark is left to soak in boiling water in order to soften it. Then a knife is used to remove the outer skin from the long fibres underneath. By mixing these fibres together again and pounding them for hours, in this case with the mechanical pestles operated by the watermill, a fairly liquid paste is obtained, which is then filtered, pressed and dried to obtain these beautiful sheets of paper. In the Middle Ages, Europe went crazy for these sheets of paper from Samarkand. They enabled writing to be distributed via a medium other than parchment or tanned animal hides. The intellectual revolution that Gutenberg would bring about with his invention of the printing press in the 15th century would not have been possible without the prior introduction of paper. In the Travels of Marco Polo describes Samarkand as a noble city adorned with beautiful gardens, surrounded by a plain, in which are produced all the fruits that man can desire. But how could so many gardens grow on the edge of a desert? The secret, in fact, lies in the glaciers and snow from the Pamir Mountains and the Himalayas that melt and provide water, which is all the more abundant in summer, explains Usman Kuramov, who is an agricultural manager. There's a lot of talk about the fabulous gardens owned by Tamerlan or Amir Timur. Do we know where they were around Samarkand?
We are in fact standing in Amir Timur's gardens. There were only big trees here in the past, but today the younger generation has created modern gardens and new technologies are being used.
Were these pleasure gardens filled with flowers or instead orchards that bore fruit?
Amir Timur's gardens were quite extraordinary. There were all kinds of fruit trees growing here. These gardens furnished all of the nutrients that people needed. Merchants who were tired after being on the road and were looking for a place to rest and regain their strength would stop next to the gardens. And so shelters were then set up near the gardens because they provided an environment that was cool and refreshing.
And back in the days of the Silk Road, which fruit was exported from the area around Samarkand?
There were no refrigerators back then, so it was dried fruits that were exported. Raisins, dried apricots, dried apples, dried melons and nuts were produced. Everything was dried under our wonderful sun, which allowed the natural properties of the fruits to be preserved.
As I leave Samarkand, I feel like I'm crossing a milestone. We have passed the halfway point in our journey, and there are many little signs that tell us this. This is the end of the world known to Western culture, the world of the Mediterranean and of Persia. I'll soon be entering a new world, the realm of the Middle Kingdom.
Toyların mübarek ona vatanım, cennetlik mekanım Uzbekistan'ım.